Okay, so today we're going deep on a set of warnings that Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave to the West back in the mid-1970s. This guy, he really went through it. Like, he saw the Soviet system from the inside out. We're going to be looking at some of his speeches. He gave them all across America and the UK. Plus, we got his letter to the Soviet leaders, too.
Yeah, and what really makes these sources stand out, right, is that they aren't just some, like, abstract theories. These are coming from someone who lived through it, the real brutality of communism. So in this deep dive, like, we really want to unpack Solzhenitsyn's message, like how alarmed he was about communism and the West's response, which he saw as inadequate, even self-defeating.
Yeah, no, for sure. We got to get into the nitty-gritty, right? Like, what exact threats did he point at, and why do you think they were so dangerous, like, to the core of Western civilization? This is a perspective that you can't get anywhere else. It's like straight from a system that just crushes the human spirit.
Right, and the context is huge here, too. So when George Meany introduced Solzhenitsyn, he was presenting him as, like, this crucial voice for liberty, going up against this massive totalitarian force. Meany even talked about this hidden movement, all these people suffering under Soviet rule, people who were systematically silenced.
And when Solzhenitsyn starts talking to the American workers, he's got this powerful greeting. He's all, brothers, brothers in labor. And then he broadens it out to include everyone there. It's like, wow, this sense of solidarity, right?
Yep.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where does Solzhenitsyn begin?
Well, he starts by going right after that famous communist slogan, workers of the world, unite. He brings it down, right? And using all this evidence, he argues that the Soviet leaders themselves never really believed in those words. So he's exposing what he sees as this, like, fundamental lie at the heart of the whole communist revolution.
And he's not just saying this, right? He takes us back, like way back to March 1918, just a few months after the October Revolution. And he's got all these records from a meeting. It was Petrograd factory representatives. Think about it. The revolution's just getting started, and these workers, the guys the whole thing's supposed to be for, they're already denouncing the communist leaders. Like, they're already calling them out for breaking their promises.
I mean, the examples are just crazy. The communist leaders, they had already moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, basically ditching the so-called cradle of the revolution. And then they go and order machine gun fire on protesting workers. And these weren't counter-revolutionaries or anything. They were literally just asking for independent factory committees, like a basic form of worker representation. And this is happening where the revolution supposedly started. It just shows this massive gap between what they were saying and what they were doing.
It's like a total betrayal right from the start. It's so hard to square those grand promises with this brutal crackdown. And he doesn't start there, right? He goes on to talk about other events that people have kind of forgotten about, like the crushing of the Petrograd strikes in 1921, and then the shooting of workers in Kolpino the same year. This wasn't just a one-off thing. It's like this disturbing pattern, the regime turning on the people it claimed to be liberating.
Exactly. And that's where he brings in this key figure, Alexander Shliapnikov. Solzhenitsyn really emphasizes that Shliapnikov was like a real, authentic worker leader in the early Communist Party. He was this super skilled lathe operator, someone who came right from the factory floor. And Solzhenitsyn contrasts him with those intellectual types like Lenin. Those guys spent a lot of their lives outside Russia. Shliapnikov, he truly represented the Russian working class, like their real experiences and interests.
And what happens to him? I mean, here's a guy fighting for workers' rights and all that.
Yeah.
He gets pushed aside. His story gets erased from history. And in the end, they arrest him, shoot him in prison, just for speaking out against the leadership, against their betrayal of workers and their grab for power. It's such a powerful contrast, this authentic working class voice versus the elite who seized control.
And that early crackdown on worker dissent is like the foundation for Solzhenitsyn's whole argument. The working class in the Soviet Union had zero power. They couldn't organize, they couldn't stand up for themselves. And he contrasts this with the West, right, where workers can actually fight for better conditions through independent unions, free trade unions.
Yeah, and he really drives home that lack of freedom with some chilling examples from later Soviet history, stuff that most people in the West have no idea about.
Yeah.
Like, he mentions these textile strikes in Ivanovo in 1930, the unrest in Murom and Alexandrovo in 1961, and then there's the Novocherkassk uprising in 1962. It's crazy, right? Because it happened during Khrushchev's supposed thaw when things were supposed to be getting better.
Yeah, the Novocherkassk uprising is a real horror show. Solzhenitsyn describes how these peaceful demonstrators, they're carrying pictures of Lenin, and they're marching to protest these terrible economic conditions and these crazy food prices. And how does the regime respond? Not with dialogue. not with negotiation, but with machine guns and tanks
Right.
against unarmed civilians. And then they go to all these lengths to cover it up. You're removing the bodies and the wounded in secret so families wouldn't even know what happened to their loved ones. It just shows you how far they would go to crush any sign of dissent, even when it came from people who were supposedly loyal to the system.
Absolutely. And he also points out how fake the Soviet trade unions were. They weren't there to help workers. They were tools of the state to control people and force them to work. He compares that to the real independent unions in the West, especially the AFL-CIO. He praises them for never falling for the Soviet Union's tricks, for standing up for workers' rights. You can tell he's really grateful for their stance.
And from there, Solzhenitsyn moves on to what he calls the strange and surprising alliance. And it is kind of paradoxical, right? It's the connection between the communist leaders and Western capitalists. He's just baffled. Like, why would Western businesses support a regime that's oppressing millions of people, denying them basic freedoms? It just doesn't make sense to him.
Right. And he gives this crazy example. It's almost hard to believe. There's this exhibit in Moscow, all this advanced crime-fighting tech. And it was specifically for the KGB to check out. This cutting-edge stuff developed in the West to catch criminals was just handed over to the Soviet secret police.
Yeah.
The KGB, the guys behind the Gulag and all that. And it seems like nobody even stopped to think like, hey, how are they going to use this? Is this going to make things worse?
Yeah, it's wild. And Solzhenitsyn really highlights how messed up this is. I mean, Western businessmen were like tripping over themselves to sell this tech to the KGB. The architects of the Gulag, he calls it incomprehensible, this chase for profits. Like nothing else matters. Not morality, not the people suffering under this regime, nothing. Just money.
It's seriously chilling. It shows a total lack of foresight. Like they couldn't see past the dollar signs. And Solzhenitsyn says, hey, Lenin saw this coming. Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, he knew how the rest worked. He knew their weaknesses. He was convinced that Western capitalists, in their greed, would actually end up helping the Soviet economy, even if it meant like their own downfall in the end.
Yeah, there's that infamous quote from Lenin, right, about the capitalists selling the rope they'd be hanged with. And when someone asked him where they'd find enough rope, Lenin was all, they will sell it to us themselves. It's scary how accurate that seems. Like he knew the West would be blinded by profits and they'd miss the real danger, this ideological threat.
And it's true, right? For decades, the Soviet press is going on about how capitalism is going to die any minute now. Like we will bury you and all that. But the West, mostly they didn't seem to take it seriously. Or maybe they just didn't want to believe it. Even when Khrushchev, flat out said it, they thought he was just bluffing. A bad joke, not a real threat.
And now it's all about détente, right? Easing tensions, peaceful coexistence. But Solzhenitsyn, he's not buying it. He's like, nothing has really changed. He says it's just a change in tactics, maybe even sneakier than the old ways. The goal's still the same. Global communism, weakening the West. That hasn't changed one bit.
He gives this historical rundown of the West's relationship with the Soviets from those early trade deals after the revolution all the way up to détente in the 70s. And his point is, this relationship has always been shaped by the Soviets, by what they are, by what they want.
And he's not afraid to get real about how brutal the Soviet system was from the start.
Yeah.
He reminds us it all began with a violent takeover. They shut down the democratically elected Constituent Assembly right away. They surrendered to Germany in World War I. They had the Cheka, the secret police, dishing out punishment and executions without any trials. They crushed worker strikes. They crushed peasant revolts, the whole thing.
He paints this grim picture, this early Soviet state built on violence and denying people basic rights. They even created famines like the Volga famine in 1921.
Yeah.
Millions died.
Yeah.
And he points out this cynical tactic that they used, create chaos and suffering, and then turn to the West for help. It's like first they break it, and then they ask for a handout to fix it. He sees parallels with what was going on in North Vietnam, maybe even Portugal too. It's a disturbing pattern.
Solzhenitsyn makes sure we remember that this was the same system that invented concentration camps way before the Nazis. They took hostages, executed them, they tricked people into coming out in the open with promises of amnesty, and then they'd kill them. He even talks about how they'd kill prisoners by just sinking barges full of them. I mean, from the beginning, it was just brutal.
And remember those early Soviet decrees, all those promises of land for the peasants, peace for the soldiers, factories for the workers, freedom of the press for everyone. Yeah, none of that happened. It was all a lie. The land got collectivized, the war kept going, the factories became state property, the press was totally controlled. The whole foundation of this system was built on broken promises and crushing anyone who stood up to them.
And this brings us to Solzhenitsyn's analysis of the West. Like, what were they doing about all of this? He's really critical of how the Western democracies handled things. Like, first, they couldn't get their act together to stop Hitler, and then they end up making this alliance with Stalin during World War II, and he thinks that was a huge mistake.
He makes this comparison that really sticks with you. Don't call a wolf to help you against the dogs. His point is, totalitarianism is totalitarianism. Don't team up with one flavor of it just to beat another. He thinks that move just made the Soviets stronger in the long run. And it helped other totalitarian regimes to rise up too, like Communist China.
Yeah, and then there's this thing Roosevelt said at the Tehran conference, right? Roosevelt says he thinks he, Churchill, and Stalin are basically leading their people according to what those people want. And Solzhenitsyn is like, what? This just blew the minds of the people stuck under the Soviet boot because they knew the truth. They knew their desires were the exact opposite of what Stalin was doing to them.
Solzhenitsyn was on his way to meet American troops at the Elbe River when he got sent to the Gulag. He was a Soviet officer at the time. He says, what a lost opportunity it was that the Allied soldiers couldn't really talk to each other back then, share their experiences. And now, 30 years later, he feels like it's his duty to finally tell the West what those soldiers couldn't.
He uses this great Russian proverb, the yes man is your enemy, but your friend will argue with you. He's basically saying, look, I'm not attacking you. I'm warning you because I care.
I get that. And then he goes point by point, laying out all these conceptions that the West made, starting with Yalta. The Soviets took over all this territory in Eastern Europe, basically swallowing up entire countries, and the West just went along with it. Didn't demand anything in return for all the help they gave during the war.
And then there's the forced repatriation. This is just awful. The West sent 1.5 million Soviet citizens back to Stalin after the war. Can you imagine? These people were fleeing the Soviets, and the West sent them back to almost certain death or imprisonment in the Gulag. And English soldiers were actually ordered to use force to do this. Some people were even killed resisting. It's just heartbreaking, a terrible betrayal.
And that pattern, that giving in, it just went on and on for the next 30 years. So Soviets expanded their influence in Asia and Africa all over. Solzhenitsyn says more people and more land were surrendered to totalitarianism during this time of so-called peace than any country lost after a war. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
And he's really critical of the Vietnam War, too. He thinks the truce was weak, that it just opened the door for the North Vietnamese to take over the South. He sees the Nobel Peace Prize given for that truce as a joke, a sign that the West was fooling itself.
He actually predicted the horrors that would come after the communists took over Vietnam and Cambodia. Like he said, millions would be killed, there would be concentration camps, and it all came true, just like he said. Think about what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. It's terrifying. And he blames it on the West, on their willingness to give up entire countries to avoid conflict.
It's this idea of appeasement, right? Like, let's just give them what they want so we can have peace and quiet. And Solzhenitsyn is like, no, that doesn't work. He was hearing people in the West say, well, maybe we should abandon Korea, Portugal, Japan, Israel, Taiwan, all of Africa. It's crazy. Like, just surrender to avoid a fight.
But even though he's super critical of the West, he also defends the U.S. He's like, hey, don't blame America for everything.
Yeah.
He pushes back against this idea that America is the source of all the world's problems.
He actually praises America for its generosity. He talks about how much they helped Europe in both world wars and after, all the aid they gave to rebuild, and how the U.S. steps up all the time to help with natural disasters and epidemics, even when it costs them a lot.
And yet, he points out, America gets a lot of hate for it. People burn down American cultural centers. The UN is constantly voting against the U.S. It's like no good deed goes unpunished.
But he thinks that, like it or not, the U.S. is the leader of the free world. History has made it that way. And he says American leaders have to think globally, not just about their own country or their own party. He thinks the fate of the world depends on them stepping up.
So he goes through these arguments that people use to justify, not standing up to communism. Like, they say it's impossible to help people who won't defend themselves. They use South Vietnam as an example.
And he's like, come on. He's saying Western Europe was in a much worse state before World War II, and no one said, oh, they're not worth saving. He's saying just because people aren't winning right now doesn't mean they've given up.
Another argument he takes on is this one. We should only help democracies. He points out that when the West faced Hitler, they teamed up with Stalin, and the Soviet Union was definitely not a democracy.
He's really good at seeing through the Soviets' tricks. Like, they talk about détente, but at the same time, they're taking over countries in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all falling to communism while everyone's talking about peace. He sees stuff like cultural exchanges and joint space missions as distractions, like smoke and mirrors to keep the West from noticing what they're really doing. He compares it to those Soviet pilots who flew over the North Pole in 1937. It was this big publicity stunt that happened right when Stalin was purging and executing millions of people.
It's crazy. And then you've got leaders like Willy Brandt saying they want to get closer to the Soviets, even though everyone knew they were committing atrocities. Solzhenitsyn is like, where are your morals? He thinks the West is so focused on like short-term gains that they're forgetting about basic human values.
And to illustrate his point, he talks about the American POWs from Vietnam. He says, based on his experience in the Gulag, the prisoners who resisted the most, who refused to break, they often just disappeared. The regime couldn't afford to let them go because their stories would expose the truth.
He even tells this wild story from the Soviet Supreme Court. This guy gets 10 years in prison just for saying something nice about American roads. Apparently that was anti-Soviet propaganda. It's just absurd. And it shows you how scared people were to even say anything that could be construed as critical of the regime.
And this leads to Solzhenitsyn's main point. He really believes that firmness is the only way to deal with communist totalitarianism. And he's not just theorizing. He's speaking from experience, from what he saw and went through in the Gulag.
And he gives all these historical examples of how standing up to the Soviets actually worked, like Finland fighting off their invasion in 1939, the West defending Berlin during the blockade, the UN standing Korea, Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even Adenauer, how he dealt with Khrushchev.
He even talks about Lenin early on, when he was scared of a German attack. Lenin basically surrendered a bunch of territory to appease them, and Solzhenitsyn says that just showed weakness and emboldened the Germans. He contrasts this with the dissident Vladimir Bukovsky. Bukovsky was facing exile, but he refused to be silenced. He demanded the release of political prisoners who were locked up in psychiatric wards. It's an incredible example of courage and standing up for what's right.
This all ties into this bigger idea that morality matters. Solzhenitsyn says that nations and people have to do what's right, even when it's not easy, even when it's not politically convenient. He brings up those deals with the devil the West made, recognizing the USSR in 1933 and allying with Stalin in 1941. And he's saying those decisions had terrible consequences.
He criticizes this idea of legal realism that was popular in the West, like as long as it's legal, it's okay. But he's saying, no, morality is higher than the law. It has to be our guide, especially when we're dealing with real evil.
And he's really worried about how people were starting to dismiss ideas of good and evil as outdated. Like, it's all relative, there are no absolutes. He says, no, good and evil are real, and it's dangerous to pretend otherwise.
Yeah.
Because then you could justify anything, you know? It's a world where power is all that matters.
Exactly. Solzhenitsyn sees two big trends going on in the world. First, you've got the West making concessions to communism, trying to appease them. And second, you've got people in the communist countries who are resisting, who are trying to liberate themselves. They're fighting for freedom.
And he says we need to support those people. Helping them isn't just charity, it's self-defense. We need to be more involved in what's happening inside those countries, not militarily, but by giving them moral and political support.
He goes back to America, right? And he says, look, America has its strengths. They're generous. They want to help. But he also warns about their trusting nature. He says people take advantage of that. And he's worried about those who use calls for peace and social justice to actually weaken America's ability to stand up to communism.
So then he gets into what communism really is. Right? He goes back to Marx and Engels, to the roots of the whole thing. And he says that the core of it hasn't changed in over 100 years, even if the tactics have.
He quotes them directly. He's showing how communism is opposed to freedom, how they're against individual rights, and get this, they actually prefer monarchy to democracy in some cases, and they believe in terror as a tool to get what they want.
So Solzhenitsyn points out that communism rejects any kind of absolute morality. It's all about class struggle, and whatever helps the proletariat, as defined by the party, is good, even if it means violence and oppression. And he's worried about how that kind of thinking is spread to the West. Like, even people who aren't communists have started thinking that way.
And he gives these concrete examples to show what communism is really about. The tanks in Budapest, crushing the Hungarian uprising, the invasion of Prague, ending the Prague Spring, the Berlin Wall, and that poor boy who was shot trying to cross it. And then there's the use of psychiatric hospitals to lock up dissidents. This is beyond just ideology. This is what communism actually does.
He brings up Angela Davis, the American activist, and he's pretty critical of her. He says she supports communist regimes no matter what they do, but she criticizes the West. It's like selective outrage, right? She's only concerned about people within her own ideological group.
He talks about how Lenin took Marx's ideas and made them even more extreme. Like, after the Paris Commune, Lenin said the problem was they didn't kill enough people. Solzhenitsyn sees this as a sign of how communism just keeps getting more brutal.
And he compares what was happening in China at the time to the early days of the Soviet Union, what they called war communism. It's all about forced labor, collective farms, and this constant bombardment of propaganda. And he points out how, even though different communist countries might seem separate on the surface, they're all connected. He compares it to an electrical current running through underground cables, and they coordinate their actions. He even mentions this time when the Soviets accidentally published their instructions to the Portuguese communists. It's like a rare glimpse behind the curtain.
And it frustrated him that even some Western socialists, guys like Olof Palme, they just didn't get it. They didn't see how oppressive communism really was. Solzhenitsyn's like, look what happened to the Russian socialists. The Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, they supported the revolution, and the Bolsheviks wiped them out.
Solzhenitsyn was really good at spotting the communist tricks. Like, they'd form these popular fronts to draw people in, but it was all a facade. They'd talk about dialogue with religion, but then they'd turn around and use violence against believers. They'd manipulate events, burn documents to cover up their true intentions.
He's like, they're not interested in peace. They see war as a tool. And he quotes Lenin saying that peace was a bad slogan because it got in the way of revolution. But then, after nuclear weapons, they started talking about peace all the time. But it was all a trick, a way to disarm the West. They were still waging war, just not the traditional kind. It was through terrorism, through imprisonment, through propaganda.
And he warns the West, like, wake up. You're becoming a minority in the world, and the communists are gaining power. And the people living under communism, they have no say in their government. It's a dangerous imbalance.
He says freedom comes at a price. And part of that price is standing up for those who are oppressed, those who are denied basic freedoms, because their struggle is our struggle too. And he keeps repeating, communism's goal is to destroy the West, no matter what they say about detente or trade. It's like Cato the Elder saying, Carthage must be destroyed over and over again.
He worries that the West has become too comfortable, too focused on their own prosperity. Like, they can't see the danger because they're too busy enjoying the good life. He's like, the Soviets break treaties all the time. Don't trust them.
And he's really critical of how little the West understands about the Soviets. The Soviets studied the West in detail, but the West, they didn't put in the same effort. They even closed down the Institute for the Study of the Soviet Union because they didn't want to fund it. It's crazy.
He warns about those shiny peace treaties that sound good but end up hurting everyone in the long run. He's like, the politicians who sign those treaties, their names will be forgotten, but the consequences will last for generations. And he's skeptical of these visions of the future where the West and the Soviets cooperate. He doesn't see how that can work with a system that wants to dominate the world.
He thinks a nuclear war might not even be necessary. The Soviets can win just by taking things bit by bit, exploiting the West's weaknesses. And he points out that the Soviets are building up their military even while they're talking about arms control.
He uses this analogy of a chess player who's so sure of himself, so focused on his own plan, that he misses what his opponent is really doing. And then, bam, checkmate.
But there's another crisis, even bigger than the political one. Solzhenitsyn sees a spiritual crisis in the West. People are losing their values, everything's becoming relative, words are losing their meaning. It's like the whole foundation of Western civilization is crumbling.
He compares it to the end of the Middle Ages, like a total shift in how people see the world. And he says Western leaders need more than just political skills. They need moral strength, they need spiritual vision to deal with all this.
He reminds us that the American founding fathers, they understood the difference between right and wrong, and their actions were guided by that. He uses the example of slavery, how they refused to compromise on that.
He believes that America, deep down, is still a good and moral country. But he warns that they can't just keep living the easy life, the comfortable life, and ignore the threats out there.
He wants to be clear. He's not asking America to attack the Soviet Union. He wants his own people to find the strength to resist from within. And he says the West can help by not supporting the regime.
He has this powerful image. He's saying, don't give the Soviets the shovels and bulldozers to bury the oppressed. In other words, stop giving them economic and technological aid that just keeps their system running.
There was this Soviet official, Mikhail Suslov, who said trade with the West was more political than economic. And Solzhenitsyn says, that's a lie. The Soviets need our help to survive. Their economy is a mess.
It's so hypocritical. The Soviets take our aid, And then they turn around and say capitalism is dying. Solzhenitsyn says, okay, then prove it. See if your system can succeed without our help.
And he's very clear. The Cold War isn't over. The communists are still fighting it through propaganda, through human rights abuses. He's not saying we should escalate things, but we should stop propping them up.
He knows it's hard for the West to be united on this. There are so many different countries, different political views. But he believes that the free world has a moral obligation to stand up to tyranny. And that includes not helping the oppressors. He has this hope for the future, what he calls the open hands period, when people from communist countries will be free to speak their minds in the West without fear. But until then, he's urging the West to be strong, to be vigilant, and most importantly, to never compromise on their values.
He ends by expressing his gratitude to the U.S. Senate for supporting him and his work. And he talks about the immense responsibility he feels to speak for those who can't. He knows there are millions of people in communist countries who hate the system but are forced to live under it. He's their voice. And he's using that voice to warn the West, to tell them what's at stake.
He makes this point about how interconnected the world is. What happens in one place affects everyone. But information gets blocked, distorted. He's trying to break through that, to tell the truth about life under communism.
Yeah.
He talks about how they made these secret agreements to reduce prison rations and create even worse forms of solitary confinement. He's saying, this is what's happening. Pay attention.
And it's human nature, right, to ignore suffering when it's happening somewhere else. But he's saying, don't wait until it's at your doorstep. He sees Vietnam as just the first of many trials the West will face.
He's putting it all on America's shoulders. You know, even though America's a young country, he says they have this burden of leadership.
Yeah.
And he reminds them that the whole world is watching, listening to what they say and do.
He's calling on American leaders to rise to the occasion, to face this crisis, both the political crisis and the spiritual crisis. He's basically saying, we need great leaders now more than ever.
And when he was in the West, you know, he was initially hopeful. He saw it as a beacon of freedom, a place of wisdom. But he was also disappointed. He mentions this article by Herbert Morrison, a British politician, that praised the Soviet Union. He couldn't believe it.
He was struck by this contrast. The people suffering under communism, they're strong in spirit. But the free West seemed to be losing its will, its sense of purpose, and it was happening so fast.
He was really concerned by this. He uses this German proverb, when courage is lost, all is lost. And a Latin one, too, about losing reason. He saw both happening in the West.
He traces it back to the West's worldview. It's all about human beings, about material things, and it's led to this focus on self-interest, on comfort. People have lost sight of higher values, of spiritual truths.
He even compares the West to pre-revolutionary Russia. The older generation retreating, the young and inexperienced taking over, revolutionaries being praised, the government becoming weak, the press losing its responsibility. It's a scary parallel.
And he points out that while he was in the West, things got even worse. The West lost more ground to the Soviets, making it even harder to help those who are oppressed. Is basically asking, how will the West avoid suffering the same fate?
He really pushes back against these labels people try to put on it, like critic of the West, patriarchal, nationalist. He says, no, I'm worried about the West losing its strength, its moral compass.
He keeps coming back to this. Good versus evil. He says that's the core of it all, and it's something that people who have suffered understand better than anyone. He's surprised by how many in the West just dismiss morality as old-fashioned. He contrasts that with how Britain stood up to Hitler. It was a moral stand, not just a political one. And he says freedom can exist without morality.
He wants to make it clear he's not attacking Lenin personally. He's attacking the ideology, the poisonous ideas of communism. And he believes that Russia can only be truly free when it's free from that ideology.
He wouldn't be surprised if the West just collapsed. He sees it happening. Their economies are based on war. They're making all these concessions to the Soviets. He says the Soviets don't even need a nuclear war to win. They're winning the ideological war, and détente is just a smokescreen. People are still being persecuted despite all the talk about Helsinki and human rights.
He says the West is actually helping the Soviets by giving them technology. It's keeping them afloat. And he's frustrated by this attitude of better red than dead. He's like, no, there are things worth fighting for, even dying for. Better to be dead than to be a coward, than to betray your values.
He sees détente as a trick, a way for the Soviets to buy time while they keep building up their power. It's like a pause before the storm. And he's worried that the West is buying into this illusion.
He's dedicated his life to telling the truth about the Soviet Union, about what happened there. He says he's writing to preserve the memory of those who suffered, those who were silenced. And he's frustrated by the Western press, how they just don't get it. He calls them shallow, short-sighted.
He challenges the idea that socialism is new and modern. He says it has ancient roots, and it often comes from a rejection of individual freedom. And he calls on socialists to really examine the beliefs of their own ideology to see where it leads.
His biggest warning is this: the West has lost the will to defend itself. He sees Britain, especially,